You're listening to MeatingPod, the podcast powered by MeatingPlace, the premier magazine and news source for the meat and poultry processing industry, and Alt Meat Magazine, the only business information resource for the exploding alternative meat industry. Welcome. I'm Chris Scott, host of MeatingPod and contributing editor of both MeatingPlace and Alt Meat magazines. Brian Kellerman is Chief Quality and Food Safety Officer at Kellerman Consulting, which helps businesses design successful food safety and quality management programs based on his decade of consulting experience. This episode will focus on some of the challenges that food processors face in establishing and maintaining the necessary protocols to ensure that their products meet required standards. Brian has implemented some of the most technically complex projects for the firm's clients and will be able to provide a unique perspective as to where food safety has been and where the concept is headed as processors aim to continue to offer safe products. Welcome to MeatingPod, Brian, and thanks for your insights today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Likewise. Now, there's no need to identify any of your clients your firm is assistant, Brian, but it would be great if you could speak generally and discuss food safety challenges that our listeners are likely to be familiar with over the last few years. Let's start with an overview of the process you and your team use to assess what's really required in a particular situation. What kinds of general issues have you run into in your experience?
Well, when it comes specifically to working with meat and poultry operations, the interaction with FSIS is one in which a facility has its established area that it's in operation, the equipment, the personnel, and when a grant of inspection is given by the FSIS, the inspectors have to come in and make sure that the program documentation and processes match the requirements for FSIS. When that happens, oftentimes there are logistical issues that come up around number of personnel or the way that equipment operates. And it can be difficult to achieve the required specifications for safety and quality of meat and poultry. So we constantly are working with clients to understand what they need to adjust in their system to meet what the inspector's requirements are and just to make sure that operations function smoothly.
Now, is that a similar experience with state-run inspections?
It can be. When the state does it, there are different channels by which it operates. FSIS operates under the grant of inspection process, and it's very programmed and it's very straightforward. With the state departments of ag, there is a similar need to regulate, but there is not a requirement necessarily for the inspectors to be there each day of operations, and there's a little bit more of an informal interaction. So the less clear-cut directives there are, the more variability there is, and so we have to work with our clients to understand how best to present to the state. And if there's going to be periods of time where there's not inspection, that just leads to a greater need for presentation of records and presentation of documents.
Right. Okay. Now, with different meat plants often facing very different situations when it comes to food safety, are there some standards that, for example, are recommended for beef processors versus poultry plants versus facilities that prepare pork products?
Yeah. When it comes to beef producers, the management of E. coli is, and specifically E. coli 0157H7, is a pretty significant issue that poultry processors, for example, don't have to deal with. They're much more concerned with salmonella and jejunji. So the managing of things like brain matter, spinal fluids, the interactions with suppliers as to how they're dealing with those things, and then the testing that is required by either the federal government or the state are pretty significant challenges. It can be costly. There can be hold times when it comes to those testing if it's required for incoming. And those are major issues that logistically can cause problems for facilities.
Now, I'm sure you're going to get to this a little bit later in our conversation, but does that also include storage and warehousing?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned previously, facilities have to take the operational area that they have and their processes, and they have to fit it into the guidelines that are required by either the federal government, the FSIS, or the state departments of ag. So when an inspector comes into the facility, if they perceive that there is not enough space for myself as an outsider coming into a facility, if I see pallets on the floor in between racks, that's a pretty good sign that we have some space issues. Now, certainly facilities can be pulling product off of shelving to get ready for shipment. And so it may be just an incidental thing to see. But for facilities that have warehousing space issues, it is extremely obvious and easy to see within a few moments of walking into a facility. And the requirements around warehousing really are that the product has to be kept safe. So for meat and poultry, other than products that are dry and can be stored ambient, there's most likely going to be cold storage. And an overstuffed freezer or an overstuffed reefer or cooler, those have potential issues around temperature control. There are also pest control issues. So a lot of times when I go into a facility, they'll try to push pallets right up against the wall. That's a common thing. You have whatever space you have in those areas, and inspectors are going to push back strongly. They're going to want to see about a 12-inch to an 18-inch barrier from the wall to where pallets are located. And that can be a real challenge for facilities.
And that, of course, is a testimony to your experience having been in a number of plants over the course of your career. Mm-hmm. Now, have you found that the compliance with your recommendations are absorbed well by your clients in the initial stages, or does it often take a more detailed report on what Kellerman Consulting has uncovered during the review stage to effect some change?
The really nice thing working with meat and poultry operations is that our system is designed to really work hand in glove with either the FSIS at the federal level or the state departments of ag at the state level. And what I mean by that is that the inspectors are telling the facilities that they need to have specific programs and have specific actions. What we are telling our clients when we work with them is how best to meet that. So generally speaking, for meat and poultry, we get very good compliance, and the process is pretty straightforward. There's a second person telling them what to do in the form of an inspector. And so it's generally easier to understand. I will say that for folks that do not have the benefit of inspection in a meat and poultry operation, so non-meat and non-poultry, it gets way more difficult because the other government agencies do not have nearly the level of control in the inspection process.
Gotcha. Now, based on your experience, what's the level of awareness among meat processors, especially the smaller ones, regarding the regular USDA or state inspections that all meat facilities are required to pass? And how often have you found that there is no principal on-site safety officer? And what options would a consulting firm like yours offer in those cases moving forward?
For a situation like that, generally speaking, at the beginning of a company's establishment, so before they have sent in a request for a grant of inspection, some of these issues come up. There's a lack of understanding of what the government's going to do. There may not be a identified food safety manager. However, because of the nature of how these meat and poultry facilities are regulated, generally speaking, there very quickly is an explanation through guidance documents from the government and a combination of meeting with the district or state officers, so that we really don't see a lot of situations where there's a lack of understanding that's just built into the way meat and poultry operations function. With that said, as new guidelines are released at the federal level or at the state level where rules change, a lot of times there's confusion. And so in those situations, we need to have follow-up meetings with our clients and really work through those issues one by one. But again, with meat and poultry, I've had a great deal of success on the whole with facilities coming to understand these issues and making the adjustments in the appropriate amount of time.
And I would suspect that one factor in that is the people that move from one business to another, taking that experience and expertise with them to the new place, which could help speed along the process of bringing a plant that may not be up to speed to the place where they need to be.
It's funny that you bring that up. That is a very important point. Generally speaking, in the United States, in the food system, folks that have worked in an FSIS or a state-regulated meat and poultry facility know very little about non-meat and poultry, the way the FDA or the state departments of ag regulate those non-meat and non-poultry, and vice versa. So folks that have traditionally worked in, let's say, a seafood operation or a juice operation have never dealt with meat and poultry. Taking an adjustment to how FSIS or the state departments of ag regulate meat and poultry can be a real significant adjustment period. And it goes the other way as well. Folks that have done meat and poultry traditionally can be quite shocked at the lack of oversight and the looseness in regulations in non-meat and non-poultry operations. But where you have folks that have their built-in experience, it is incredibly helpful as they move from one company to another.
And your firm offers consulting services to all types of food production companies. And I just want our listeners to remember that we're talking about meat and poultry specifically because we deal with so many processors in our audience.
Absolutely. I have worked with, and my company has worked with every facet of the food industry, from primary producers of agricultural commodities and animal raising and slaughter, all the way through pretty much every category of finished products. We work extensively with meat and poultry facilities, and I am constantly trying to keep track of which government agency might be involved, whether there's dual jurisdiction, whether multiple government agencies are going to be involved in a single operation, and if that's the case, which of those agencies are going to take the lead in the jurisdiction and enforcement. For meat and poultry facilities, it's usually the easiest to understand, again, because at the federal level and at the state level, there's just a lot of documentation. There's a lot of guidelines and pretty aggressive enforcement. So you have a government inspector present frequently.
And of course, that's when you can tap into your expertise to determine which type of certification program might be most appropriate for those companies.
Absolutely. And at that certification level, and admittedly, the certification programs are really where we do a significant amount of interaction with clients. That's the most confusing part of the food safety and quality process, is at the certification level, taking regulatory actions. So the interactions with government inspection, with the ordinary processing realities at the regulatory level of day-to-day operation, and then ramping it up into a certification program can be a pretty big challenge. The good news is for meat and poultry facilities is that that government interaction, the presence of an inspector, really is a huge, important part of the certification process. And so all of those interactions get to be presented during certification as proof that the facility is meeting their food safety requirements.
And on that note, what would you describe as the ideal setup for any generic meat processing plant in terms of establishing consistent food safety practices? And this is especially important in order to protect the manufacturing process, worker safety, delivery of safe products, and even development of new products, right?
Absolutely. So in all of those situations, the most important thing for a facility is to have written records. This is something that facilities that have been in operation for a very long time really know, because it's just they've been forced to do it. But whether you're developing a new product and you need to have written records of all of the things that went into developing that new product, whether you are changing equipment, doing repair, adding new products, adding shifts, any of those things, writing it down is the most important thing. What causes problems for most facilities is that when an inspector or when any outsider is coming in to ask questions, that could be an auditor, that can be an inspector, they need to have something in writing to evaluate. The issues that come up oftentimes where there's conflict is an inspector or an auditor is trying to determine what to assess, and the people being inspected or audited are explaining to them verbally, this is what we do here. And that causes lots of problems because the inspectors and auditors are not allowed to ask you directly, you have to have this in writing. They simply have to talk around the fact that they cannot take your word for it.
Right.
And since they can't take the person's word for it, there are frequently conflict and disagreements in that moment, and those conversations can become unpleasant, whereas written records really solve that. So in all areas of operations, we really love to see people writing things down. Now, the wonderful thing is that emails, text messages, pictures, those things really are written records. And so those can be presented as well. And we just encourage folks, have a system in place. There are also lots of technological solutions, things like Slack and other apps, other recording programs that folks can have internally to communicate with each other. Even if a verbal conversation makes the most sense, go ahead after you're done with that conversation and just write down what that conversation was when it pertains to food safety issues, when it pertains to changes in operation. And with a date stamp and a time stamp, with a written record of who was talking and what was said, those things can be presented, and they are really, really helpful in making sure that compliance is demonstrated.
And without that documentation, of course, it could potentially delay approval on the regulatory side or reports that clear the company to do what it needs to do to sell its products.
Absolutely. And when you're dealing with regulators in a meat and poultry facility at that federal level or state level, delays can be really just killers for operation, because when we're dealing with items that are refrigerated, generally we have short hold times or short shelf lives, and every day counts. So having written records, being able to produce those quickly to the regulators is crucial to making sure that you get the best out of your operation.
Now, speaking of which, Kellerman Consulting provides a wide range of certification assistance for food manufacturers in need of adjusting their current operations for whatever reason. Can you walk our listeners through that process, and how do companies usually react once you make a recommendation?
Sure. When someone calls us up and they are looking for a certification as opposed to meeting a regulatory requirement, our first questions are going to be, why are you doing this? If a opportunity arises, if a customer that is going to be a valuable customer for someone is asking for a certification, that helps us know that it's a project that our potential customers or existing clients are going to be committed to. So the first and foremost thing that we want to know is, do you understand why pursuing a certification is going to be good for your business? Because any pursuit of certification is going to be a lot of work. It takes a lot of written records. There are meetings involved. You really need to have commitment from staff to go above and beyond the bare minimum. And those can be difficult. So we want to know from folks, do you already know why you are doing this? Once that's determined, then we would link them up to the most sensible program. For meat and poultry operations, there's a certification scheme called BRCGS, and that's the most common in industry. That's a British program, so it's not as common in the United States for other types of food industry, but in meat and poultry, it's common. The other most common is called SQF. And SQF is sort of informally the American version of these higher certifications. So we usually see companies pursuing one of the two of those. There's a third one called FSSC 22000 that's a little more obscure. We do occasionally have folks asking for that if they have sister companies in Europe or Asia that also have it. And then beneath those standards are what are called GMP certifications. Those are not international standards. They are more localized to the certifying bodies in the United States. And those are a little simpler than those fancier programs. As we match folks up, again, it becomes very complicated very quickly. We just want our clients to know this is what I need and this is who's asking for it. And that really helps for a successful project.
Now, generally speaking, meat processors need to rely on production managers and other employees who execute the various functions needed to keep the line flowing effectively. Do you find that the bulk of the companies you've experienced have established some sort of network connections throughout their facilities, or are some meat plants still behind the curve and need to be taught about the importance of effective communication throughout the plant?
That's a great question. And it's difficult to generalize only because each operation is so unique in the number of employees they have, in leadership. What I can tell you is that for facilities that have very strong leadership, the communication and the interactions between the operational employees on the line tend to be much better. where there's weaker leadership or less leadership, you tend to lack accountability. And in situations where there's less accountability, each employee on the line kind of makes their own decisions and decides how they want to do it. And where there's disagreements on the best way to do things, you'll end up with conflict. And leadership is really the best way to smooth those things over. So a established business with clear leadership and accountability of the on-the-line employees, the needed communication, and again, to come back with those written records, the filled out written records are usually there. And so usually we see a lot of success in those things. Where you have facilities where there's lack of leadership or ineffective leadership, then you start to see a lot of these problems with failed communication, inconsistent record keeping, and things of that nature.
And trying to fix things on the fly from a number of different approaches and different sources, of course, presents its own challenges, right?
Absolutely. And when you're dealing with, again, specifically to meat and poultry facilities, where there's an inspector on site, they pretty much understand and can figure out what's going on, oftentimes before the leadership of the facility does. And that is an enormous challenge when the inspector is coming to you and saying, I have noticed a problem. What are you doing about it? And where leadership is unaware, that can be a very challenging situation, very embarrassing. And oftentimes it can be a disruption to operation.
Unfortunately. Now, is there a general timeline for implementing some of the changes that you and your team find are needed to improve food safety challenges that are uncovered in a food manufacturing plant?
Absolutely. For any part of operation, you mentioned new product development. And so, for example, where we're starting from something new or where there's a deviation in operation. So during normal function operations where something has come up that is not working, there needs to be a timeline established. So if something is an emergency, we obviously want to take care of it same day or the next day. Where something requires a new part, a new piece of equipment, we just want to keep track of what our expected end date or time is going to be. Even if we can't meet that, we can always come back and write down, hey, we expected to have this the following Monday, but the part was delayed, the service provider could not come, and it's going to be the following day or sometime later in the week. If there's a good paper trail of what the expected fix was going to be and any delays that came up, generally speaking, you're going to find that you get good compliance from the people who are needing you to make those fixes, and the team understands what's going to happen next. And that's always the best.
And that documentation covers everybody in terms of understanding what has to happen from then on.
Absolutely.
Now, how far has the meat industry come in terms of food safety issues over the last decade or so, in your experience? And what would you identify as some of the possible challenges some of these companies may face down the road?
I think the meat and poultry industry has been pretty set over the last 10 years. There are changes that are made. There are new guidance documents. There has been an increase in testing requirements for incoming ingredients and outgoing products. But for the most part, it's stayed, I don't want to say the same, but it has remained understandable in the same way over the last decade. What we have seen is the implementation of automated systems and robotics that has ramped up significantly to go along with the changes in technology that we've seen specifically over the last 5 years that have presented the greatest amount of change and updates in the industry. So facilities that traditionally used to write things down, they now have apps and tablets that are being used in the facility and electronically recorded information that's being stored somewhere and needs to be identified where that's being stored. And somebody has to put eyes on it and sign off that they're doing checks of that electronically recorded or automated information. Those would be the biggest changes and challenges we've seen since we got started.
And on that note, at least one meat manufacturer faced a massive recall of products that were linked to the hospitalization of scores of consumers and at least 10 deaths last year, so we know that food safety remains a major issue. Is there a standardized plan designed to address these potential problems, or is each situation so different that there's rarely one generic program that can be implemented beyond current inspection protocols?
We find on the whole, the set requirements around established recall plans, traceability requirements, and food safety documentation at the federal and state level has done a reasonably good job in keeping people safe. Where you have very tragic and unfortunate situations with pathogens, with foreign material that leads to hospitalization and death, usually there is something unique or unusual about those situations. And oftentimes those tragic events are the culmination of one or more unexpected or unusual events that were not noticed in time. So when we see those things, what we usually like for and recommend to our clients as a response to that, thankfully, we have not had any clients directly involved in any of those types of events, but we are really excited when we see folks challenging their system, taking the opportunity to do traceback exercises, mock recalls, crisis tests. And these are things that are required at the level of certifications, but are not necessarily as enforced at the food safety level, at the government level. So we try to encourage folks to increase their practicing of those things, scheduling those events, making sure their teams are very well understanding of their responsibilities should there be any kind of emergency that comes up.
And finally, you mentioned technology, which I unfortunately did not include in our questioning today. But what may be next for food processors that's going to be needed to maintain or improve safety measures in their manufacturing plants? And have you found that the meat industry players overall really understand the urgency in meeting regulatory safety standards or implementing new approaches to protect the customers?
Well, in meat and poultry, we see, generally speaking, less technologically sophisticated businesses on the whole. For meat and poultry facilities, and I'm hoping that they are nodding along when they hear this, generally speaking, they're very exceptionally well-run facilities, but they're not necessarily technologically advanced. There are obviously robotics and automated equipment that are involved in operations, but on the whole, we don't see the sort of science fiction type stuff in meat and poultry. With that said, everyone is aware of this incredible push using artificial intelligence, or what is called artificial intelligence. And because data collection and the movement towards analysis using computer software is a movement we're all heading towards, and because meat and poultry operations tend not to necessarily be amongst the most sophisticated, technologically speaking, of businesses, there's just a real push and pull there. And I can tell you that Kellerman Consulting is not a pusher of technology. We do not sell software. We really try to work with folks where they are. We really appreciate folks that just have really good comprehensive systems in place, and that whatever they're using, whether it's technologically advanced, whether there's fancy software, AI, whatever, that somebody's checking and making sure that it's working properly.
So you check to make sure that there's at least some communication within the entity so that that can continue to improve their food safety protocols.
Exactly.
I'd like to thank Brian Kellerman of Kellerman Consulting for outlining his perspectives on the current state of food safety and processing plants, even as the industry continues to report issues that could threaten the health of the public. And of course, thanks to our MeatingPod listeners for tuning in this week and beyond. That's a wrap. Until next time. Remember to tune in on Mondays to get the inside track on the people and the processes that drive the protein industry. Be sure to subscribe to MeatingPod on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow Meeting Place and Alt Meat magazines on social media, and be sure to visit our websites at meetingplace.com and altmeat.net.